We've previously looked at using the schema-first approach, but in this video we'll use code to define our GraphQL schema and the resolvers to build our server. Pothos is just a schema builder, so we'll need a GraphQL server in order to serve that schema. In this video we'll be using GraphQL Yoga, and with GraphQL Yoga we'll pass it the required schema, but instead this schema will be built using code. No longer will we provide the type definitions and resolvers. To get started, we'll install Pothos core. Now inside of our code, we'll go ahead and import schema builder. We'll take schema builder and we'll create a new constant called builder, and we'll call new schema builder. This takes some options that we can configure later, such as plugins. Then all that's left to do to generate the schema is called builder.toSchema. Then if we start the server and then head to graphical, we can see here that we don't have any schema just yet, but things are almost working. Next, we'll go ahead and define some types, mutations, input types, and more. Before we begin, let's go ahead and create some TypeScript types here. We're going to be building a shopping cart API, so we're going to create a type for both cart and cart item. Now that we've got these TypeScript types, we can tell the schema builder about them in the form of generics. So here we can pass our list of objects. We'll tell Pothos that the cart object is of the shape cart, and the same for cart item. While we're at it, we're also going to be using a custom scalar for ID. So here, we'll create the input and output types for the accessors on the ID scalar. Here, we'll say that input is of type string, and the output is also a string. Next, we'll go ahead and create an array of carts, and we'll simply provide an ID for these carts, as well as an array of items. So now we have a fixed array of items in our cart. This of course could come from your database, but for the purposes of this video, we'll just use this constant here that is an array of different carts that follows the shape of our types above. Let's first begin by creating our object type for the cart. We'll call builder.objectType, and then we'll use the same object that we defined in the generics above. In here, we'll call this cart. And for the fields, we can provide all of the different fields that this has. And here we can use a special method called exposeString. This will expose the underlying ID, and we'll do the same for items. Instead of calling expose something for the items, we'll call t.field, and here we can provide the type. And I'm going to provide an array here, and inside of the array, we'll use cart item. And this will tell Pothos that the items field is an array of the type cart item. And then all we need to do is provide the resolver function here to return the cart items. So for the root parent argument here, we can call cart.items, and if there's nothing there, we can simply return an empty array. Next, let's go ahead and create the object type for cart item. We'll provide it the cart item type name as the first argument, and then for the second, we'll provide all of the different fields. So just like we have above, we'll call ID, and we'll here call expose ID. Then we can provide it the ID field that we wish to expose, and then we can do the same for t.exposeString for the name field. And finally, for the quantity, we can call t.exposeInt, and we can provide that quantity field. We won't expose the price because we're going to do something a little bit different later. But let's finish this off by creating a query type. In here, we'll specify the fields, and using that same shorthand function t, we can call our first query called cart. And we'll specify that this is a field that is nullable, and it has arguments. The only argument that we'll do in this video will be to collect a argument ID, and here we'll specify that this is of the type ID, and that it's required. You can also go ahead and create things like default values, deprecation reasons, and descriptions. So let's add a short description here. Then we'll need to provide the type, and here this will be cart from our custom objects. If you've written GraphQL resolvers before, you'll know that from the second argument, we can fetch that all-important ID from the arguments. Then, inside of this function, we can use that ID to look up from our array of carts that we've hard-coded above, and we'll iterate through those carts to find a cart where the ID matches that of the cart ID that we passed to the query. If there's no cart, we'll simply throw an error, otherwise we'll return that cart. And now with this, we can start our GraphQL server, head on over to graphical, and refresh, and if we now look inside of the Documentation Explorer, we can see that we have a root type for query. And if we go into that, we can see that we have a field for cart that accepts an argument of ID of the type ID scalar that is required. And this returns the cart type. If we load the cart type, we can then see that the ID is of type string. We could change this to ID, and it has items, which returns that list of cart items. Then, if we go into that cart item type, we can see that has an ID of the scalar ID, name of string, and quantity of the non-nullable int. Let's begin by using the cart query, and we'll pass it that important ID. We know we have a cart with the ID of 1, so here we'll provide 1 to the arguments, then we'll return ID and all of the items. We'll also fetch the ID of the items, the name, and the quantity. Then, if we run this GraphQL query, we can see here that the resolve function ran, found the cart with the ID of 1 from the array, or in your case, that could be a database, and it's resolved that data in the response here. Now, it would be nice to see what the actual totals for my cart and cart items are. So what we'll do is use a special function from GraphQL Pothos, and we'll use something called the object reference. We can then implement the reference for these objects, and we can provide a custom resolver for those. Let's declare a new variable here, and we'll call this money. We'll then use builder, and now we'll use object ref. You can learn more about what this does and what arguments it accepts by reading the Pothos documentation. We'll provide a generic here, and we'll just specify that this is of the type number. Then we'll give it a name of money, and then we can call implement. We can then pass to implement all of the different fields that's on this new type. Then, using that special T, we can provide our different fields here. For things like the subtotal, line total, and the cart subtotal, we want to get the amount, the raw amount, and we also want to get a formatted amount. So first of all, we'll declare the field amount, and we'll call this of the type int, and we'll specify the resolve function here simply returns the amount that it has. Then, for the formatted amount, we'll specify that this is of the type string. And for formatted, we'll return the amount, but formatted. And because we're working in cents, we'll format the amount by 100. Then all that's left to do is use that instead of our object types for cart and cart item. For the cart, we want to provide a field for subtotal, and here we'll call t.field, and we'll pass the type here now as money. Now we'll need to actually provide the value for this field, so we'll go ahead and do that by providing a custom resolver. We can then go ahead and resolve the subtotal amount by reducing all of the items in the cart to add together all of the different prices multiplied by the quantity. And for the default, we'll provide the 0 value. So now we have the subtotal for our cart. Let's go down to the cart item. In here, we want to provide 2 new fields for both the line total, which includes the price multiplied by the quantity, and then the unit total, so we can get that raw and formatted amount for each of the items in the cart, instead of just calling the price directly. And again, just like we did above, we can provide the type money, and then we can create that resolver for our item, line total. Now that we've implemented the money type across our different object types, we can now update our query to include all of those different fields that we've just created using code. So here we'll get the line total amount, as well as the formatted amount, and for the unit total, we can get the same. Then we can also get the subtotal for all of the cart items. Here we'll get the amount and the formatted amount. And here we can see that we have the line total in the formatted amount, as well as the unit total. If we go back to our cart and we update the quantity here to be 5, and we head back and rerun this query, we can now see that the unit amount is 1,000, but the line total is 5,000. And if we explore the documentation, we can see our cart and cart items are now using that all-important money type. Next, we want to provide a way to use a GraphQL mutation to add items to the cart. And for this, we'll explore using a plugin with Pothos. Once that plugin's installed, we'll need to configure the schema builder and tell it the plugins that we wish to use. So here we can provide an empty array, and at the top, we'll now go ahead and import that plugin. Now, all that's left to do is implement the actual mutation type that we can do using the builder. So let's call builder.mutationType, and here we can provide an object with all of our different mutation fields. We'll name the mutation add item, and now when we access T, we can use this special field with input method. Now inside of here, we can use input, and this will wrap all of our input types with this special input keyword. Then let's go ahead and declare all the different input arguments that are required for this type. Then once we've declared all the different fields on our input type, we can then provide the actual type that this returns. And this will be of the type cart. Then all that's left to do is create the function that resolves our new cart with our newly passed item. So let's destructure from our arguments the input type. In here we'll fetch the cart ID and we'll spread everything else into input. Then, just like we did above, we can grab this code to check for our cart item to see if it exists already. And if it does, we can assign it to the cart variable. We'll update the ID to use the ID that we just passed in for our cart. And then we'll simply return the new object, which will be our new cart. So here we'll provide the ID, cart ID. And for our items, here we can spread in all of the existing items inside of our cart, as well as the new item, which we spread into the variable input. Now, back inside of GraphQL, if we refresh and head to the documentation, we can see we have root types for query and the newly added mutation type. We can see here that we have the add item field and the input type with all of the fields that we declared, including that default value of 1 for our quantity. And lastly, all of this returns the cart type, which will include the ID, items, and that all-important subtotal that we previously defined. So now let's create a new tab and run a GraphQL mutation. And using that plugin input, we can see here that our input type is prefixed with this input. We can now provide a cart ID, and we'll call this 1. We'll provide an ID for our new cart item, which we'll call 2. Then we'll give a name for our item, as well as a price, and a quantity, and we'll give this a quantity of 2. Then from the response, we can get the ID of the cart, items, and the subtotal. And here we can see that we have a new subtotal for our cart, which includes the items from the existing array, as well as the new item that we've just passed in. Then we can see all of our items in the cart. We created all of this with code. With Pothos, we can define all of our queries, our root types, our input arguments, and just things like the description. Everything was done with code and there was no SDL in sight. This is just one way to build a GraphQL schema, and we'll explore more using Pothos in a future video.